May 1945, Texas. The Luftwaffe ace thought he'd rot in a POW camp. He braced himself for barbed wire and hunger. He expected the enemy he was promised. Instead, an American guard handed him a cup of coffee. He was told he would need it for the job. Hauptmann Weber, a pilot with 30 victories, was a prisoner of war under the Geneva Convention. But this was no ordinary prison. The Americans were not just guarding him, they were preparing him. If captivity is meant to strip a soldier of his purpose, what happens when your enemy gives you a new one? Please share your city and local time in the comments. We are interested to see how far these accounts reach. If stories of honor and difficult choices matter, subscribe to keep them alive. Hauptmann Karl-Heinz Weber walked through the gates under the relentless Texas Sunday. It was May 1945. The war in Europe was over, but his war had just entered a new, uncertain phase. The dust from the road clung to his uniform, a fine powder of defeat. He kept his back straight, his eyes fixed ahead, a habit ingrained by a decade in the Luftwaffe. He was a German officer, a pilot with 30 confirmed victories, a face once featured in newsreels celebrating the Reich's might. Now, he was a prisoner, and the propaganda he had listened to for years played on a loop in his mind. Goebbels' voice, sharp and certain, had promised what awaited them here: starvation, beatings, and the ultimate humiliation for a soldier. He prepared himself for the blows that never came. Instead, the first thing he noticed was the smell. It was not the stench of misery or unwashed bodies he had been steeling himself against. It was the scent of baking bread, warm and wholesome, drifting from a mess hall. It was the scent of a normal day, which was the most abnormal thing he could have imagined. As he and the other captured airmen were marched toward a processing barracks, he heard American guards laughing nearby, sharing a joke he couldn't understand. Their ease was unsettling. This wasn't the fury of a vengeful enemy. It was just a day at work. This strange sense of unreality was part of a deliberate, nationwide policy. The United States held roughly 425,000 Axis prisoners across nearly 700 camps by the war's end. Their treatment was strictly governed by the Geneva Convention of 1929, a set of rules the American High Command chose to interpret with methodical precision. In camps like Hearn and Swift, both deep in the heart of Texas, the policies were clear. Prisoners of war were to receive the same food rations as American soldiers. Officers were not to be forced into hard labor. Their dignity, as military men, was to be respected. To the Germans arriving from a continent torn to shreds, where survival was a daily battle for a crust of bread or a dry place to sleep, this adherence to rules felt like a fantasy. They had been subjects of a government that saw treaties as suggestions, to be discarded when inconvenient. They could not comprehend an enemy who followed the rules, especially when no one was watching. For Weber, every moment of humane treatment was a quiet accusation against the lies he had been told his entire adult life. The propaganda had been a shield, a justification for his fight. But here, in the Texas heat, that shield was beginning to crack. He remembered the American guard who had processed his arrival. A corporal, younger than any pilot in his squadron, had checked his name off a list. When Weber hesitated, the young man had looked up, not with hatred, but with a weary professionalism. It was then that he handed Weber the cup. The coffee was hot and bitter, a shocking luxury. "You'll need it," the guard had said, his English simple and direct. "For tomorrow's lesson." The words hung in the air, a puzzle without context. Lesson? What lesson could a prisoner of war possibly need to learn? The phrase followed him as he was led to his barracks. Inside, another impossibility awaited him. A clean bunk with neatly folded sheets and a thin wool blanket. His fellow prisoners were silent, their faces a mixture of confusion and suspicion. He recognized a few of them, pilots like Lieutenant Dieter Schultz, who now leaned against a wall, arms crossed, his expression a mask of defiant pride. Schultz met Weber's gaze, a spark of shared resentment in his eyes, but said nothing. Words felt useless here. They had been trained for combat, for survival in a hostile sky, not for this quiet, orderly captivity. That night, sleep did not come easily. The cot was surprisingly comfortable, but Weber's mind was a battlefield. He lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the American night. He thought of the broadcasts from the Ministry of Propaganda. They had painted a vivid picture of American soldiers, uncivilized brutes, gangsters in uniform, who would take pleasure in tormenting a defeated foe. The stories were meant to stiffen their resolve, to make surrender seem worse than death. The reality of the camp was a direct assault on those beliefs. The evening meal had been stew, thick with meat and potatoes, served with the same bread he had smelled upon arrival. There had been no pushing, no shouting, just an orderly line. He ate every bite, the simple act of satisfying his hunger, feeling like a form of betrayal. If the Americans were not the monsters he'd been taught to hate, then who were they? And if the stories about the enemy were false, what other truths had been twisted or withheld by his own leaders? That question was more terrifying than any physical threat. The barbed wire outside the barracks was real, a clear symbol of his imprisonment. But it was the crumbling walls of his certainty that truly made him feel trapped. Lying there in a clean American bed, Karl-Heinz Weber felt a foundation of his world give way, leaving him suspended over an emptiness he did not know how to navigate. The enemy had captured his body, but it was their unexpected mercy that was beginning to capture his mind. The morning after his arrival, the meaning of the guard's words became clear. Weber and a handful of other senior Luftwaffe officers were escorted not to a labor detail, but to a small wooden administrative building set away from the main barracks. The room inside was plain, furnished only with a simple table and several chairs. A man in the uniform of a U.S. Army Air Forces lieutenant colonel stood waiting for them. He was older than the guards, his face weathered and serious. He introduced himself as James Harrington. There was no menace in his posture, no hint of the interrogation tactics they had been warned about. Instead, he motioned for them to sit, and another soldier brought in a pot of coffee. The Germans exchanged wary glances. This was a calculated performance, they thought, a trick to disarm them before the real questioning began. But the questions, when they came, were not about military secrets or troop movements. Harrington didn't ask about a secret weapon or the location of a hidden bunker. He asked about flying. He wanted to know how the Messerschmitt Bf 109 handled in a tight, climbing turn. He asked about the optimal range for its cannons and the subtle tricks German pilots used to conserve fuel on long escort missions. He spoke to them not as prisoners, but as fellow professionals. At first, Weber resisted. He gave clipped, technical answers, volunteering nothing more than what was asked. To do more felt like a violation of an unspoken code. Sharing tactics was a form of treason, a betrayal of the men he had flown with, many of whom were now dead or scattered across the ruins of Germany. He could feel the angry stare of Dieter Scholz from across the table, a silent judgment that mirrored his own internal conflict. But Lieutenant Colonel Harrington was patient. He laid out his reasoning with a blunt, disarming honesty. He explained that American boys were still flying, and they would continue to fly long after this war was over. He spoke of new threats on the horizon, new conflicts where American pilots might face aircraft and tactics born from German engineering. He said their experience, their hard-won knowledge from thousands of hours in combat, could save lives. His request was simple: help us shorten their odds. The words struck Weber with an uncomfortable force. This wasn't about patriotism or ideology. It was a pragmatic appeal to his identity as a pilot, a craftsman of the air. This strange interview was part of a little-known American intelligence program codenamed Operation Rusty, running from 1943 until 1946. Its purpose was quiet but crucial: to extract tactical and technical knowledge from captured German airmen. This was not the more famous Operation Paperclip, which smuggled scientists out of Germany to work on rocket programs. Operation Rusty operated within the confines of the Geneva Convention, relying on voluntary instruction from prisoners of war. The American military understood a critical truth of the air war. While the Luftwaffe had lost over 40,000 aircraft, and ultimately the war, its top aces had achieved kill ratios that baffled Allied commanders. Their insights into dogfighting, gunnery, and squadron formations were an invaluable resource. To the Americans, the war in Europe might be over, but the lessons it held were essential for the future. For captured pilots like Weber, this program presented a profound moral crossroads. They were being asked to transform their greatest skill, the art of killing American airmen, into a tool for protecting them. The true weight of that choice became clear a few days later. While walking the perimeter of the camp, under the watchful but distant eyes of a guard, Weber saw the airfield next to the prison. Young American cadets, boys barely out of their teens, were climbing into the cockpits of their P-51 Mustangs. They moved with the nervous energy of the inexperienced, their faces a mixture of excitement and fear. One of them, a fresh-faced trainee who looked no older than 17, caught sight of the German prisoners watching from behind the wire. He gave a short, hesitant wave before turning his attention back to his pre-flight checks. Weber didn't wave back. He simply watched as the powerful engines roared to life and the planes taxied onto the runway for a training exercise. He followed their ascent into the vast Texas sky, his pilot's eye tracing their movements. Later that afternoon, a plume of black smoke rose from beyond a line of distant hills, followed by a sudden, heavy silence. A training accident. It was a common tragedy of aviation, a deadly consequence of a small mistake, magnified by the unforgiving laws of physics. The news spread through the camp in hushed whispers. The cadet who crashed was the same one who had waved. Weber felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The boy hadn't been killed by an enemy bullet. He had been killed by his own inexperience. Mercy and rules could shield a prisoner from cruelty, but they couldn't shield a young pilot from a fatal error. The image of that boy's nervous wave was now burned into his memory. Suddenly, Harrington's request felt different. It was no longer an abstract question of loyalty to a collapsed nation. It was a concrete question, sharp and urgent, that echoed in the silence left by the fallen plane. If my knowledge could save one of them from that fate, is it still betrayal? The blackboard was a stark, unfamiliar landscape. Weber picked up a piece of chalk, the white dust coating his fingertips. It felt alien in a hand accustomed to the grip of a joystick. He began to draw. With clean, precise lines, he sketched the lethal geometry of a dogfight, the climbing turns, the barrel rolls, the optimal angle of deflection for a killing shot. He explained the nuances of Luftwaffe dive-bombing tactics, the specific vulnerabilities of American bombers he had exploited time and again, and the subtle engine tricks his squadron used to extend their range by a precious few minutes. The American cadets in the classroom listened with a quiet, focused intensity. They took notes, their faces unreadable. For Weber, the act was a surreal form of dissection, laying bare the soul of his craft for the benefit of those he was trained to kill. The deepest crack in his old world came not in the classroom, but outside it. One afternoon, as he was leaving the instruction building, Lieutenant Colonel Harrington passed him, stopped, and rendered a crisp, formal salute. It was a gesture of professional respect, officer to officer. It was also an earthquake. Weber, stunned, instinctively returned the salute. The enemy, he had been told, was a subhuman barbarian, devoid of culture or honor, was now saluting him. This simple act of military courtesy felt more damaging to his old beliefs than any physical blow. The Reich he had served had, in its final frantic months, treated its own pilots as expendable fuel for a dying fire. Here, in an enemy prison camp thousands of miles from home, he was being treated with more professional dignity than he had been shown by his own high command. This respect was not an accident. It was a matter of policy. The American approach to German prisoners, especially in the later years of the war, was a strategy of re-education through exposure. The theory was simple. Rather than trying to indoctrinate prisoners with lectures on democracy, it was more effective to simply show them how a democratic society behaved. Fair treatment, adherence to international law, and basic human dignity were meant to be living examples that directly contradicted Nazi propaganda. This stood in stark contrast to the conditions faced by Allied prisoners in German hands. In camps like Stalag Luft III, prisoners endured meager rations and constant surveillance. As the war ended in the winter of 1945, thousands of Allied POWs were forced on brutal marches westward, away from the advancing Soviet army. These death marches, conducted in freezing temperatures with little food or shelter, claimed thousands of lives. While over 90,000 Americans were held by Germany, their mortality rate was approximately 12%. For the hundreds of thousands of Axis prisoners held in the United States, that rate was less than 1%. One system saw prisoners as a burden to be discarded. The other saw them as a responsibility to be managed under law. One day, a letter arrived through the Red Cross. It was from his sister. The paper was worn thin, the ink faded from its long journey. The news it carried hollowed him out. Dresden was gone. The city he remembered, a jewel of art and culture, was now a wasteland of ash and rubble. His family was scattered, their home destroyed, their survival uncertain. He read the letter again and again, the words blurring. The government that had demanded his absolute loyalty, the regime that had sent him into the sky to die for the fatherland, had utterly failed to protect its own people. It had promised a 1,000-year empire and delivered an apocalypse. Any lingering sense of duty to that fallen Reich evaporated in that moment, replaced by a cold, empty grief. The war in Europe officially ended in May 1945, and a wave of relief washed over the POW camps. The prisoners expected a swift repatriation, but the weeks turned into months. The vast machinery of demobilization moved slowly. Weber and thousands of others remained in Texas through the rest of 1945 and into 1946. Some were even transferred to work camps in Britain or France to aid in reconstruction, their captivity extended by another year. When he was finally sent home, he returned to a ghost of a country. Germany was a nation of ruins and hungry people. Finding work was nearly impossible. His family, when he found what was left of them, was bitter and exhausted. When he tried to explain his time in America, the clean sheets, the decent food, the respectful treatment, they looked at him with suspicion. His stories of American mercy were dismissed as fantasy or, worse, as the lies of a collaborator who had sold out his country to make his own imprisonment easier. The dignity he had been so carefully guarded behind the wire became a source of shame in the ruins of his homeland. He had been an enemy ace, a prisoner, and a teacher, but back among his own people, he was just a man with a story no one wanted to believe. The years that followed his return were a long, quiet penance. Weber found a modest job as a clerk in a rebuilding city, a position that required little more than neat handwriting and the ability to be invisible. He lived in a small apartment, the silence of which was often louder than the roar of his Messerschmitt's engine had ever been. The central question of his captivity followed him into this new, grey life. Was he a traitor? The accusation, spoken and unspoken by his countrymen, was a constant companion. He had given aid to the enemy. He had shared knowledge that could be used against German allies in a future conflict. The guilt was a heavy cloak he could never seem to take off. Yet, beneath it, another thought persisted, stubborn and unwelcome. He remembered the face of the young cadet who crashed. He remembered the steady, pragmatic gaze of Lieutenant Colonel Harrington. Had his loyalty been to a flag, a failed ideology, or to something more fundamental? He had been a soldier, sworn to fight, but he was also a pilot, a master of a deadly craft, and a deep, professional part of him recognized that knowledge shared could be knowledge that saves. He wrestled with this for years, a solitary debate in the ruins of his former life. His honor, once a thing of medals and victories, was now a confusing, private shame. Then, one autumn day in 1950, a letter arrived. The envelope was thin, the postmark from a town in Iowa, USA. He stared at it for a long time before his trembling fingers managed to tear it open. The name on the letter was unfamiliar. Robert Mills. The words, written in neat, careful English, began to form a picture he had long tried to forget. The writer had been a young flight cadet in Texas. He had been one of the students in Weber's classroom. He wrote that he was now flying missions over a place called Korea. He described a dogfight, a terrifying dance of machines at high altitude, where a single mistake meant death. He had been outnumbered, his opponent closing in fast. And in that critical moment, he had remembered a lesson from a German POW. He remembered what Weber had said about patience in a turn fight, about resisting the instinct to pull back hard on the stick, a move that would bleed precious airspeed and make him an easy target. Mills had followed the lesson. He had waited, held his nerve, and the moment had passed. He had survived. The letter ended with a simple sentence. "I don't know if you'll ever get this, sir, but I wanted you to know that I lived because of what you taught me." Weber put the letter down on his small kitchen table. The silence in the room was different now. It was no longer an accusation. It was a space for a new kind of truth. He was not a traitor. He was not a hero. He was a teacher. This quiet, personal resolution was a microcosm of a much larger, slower process of reconciliation. The American policy of humane treatment for POWs, born of both principle and pragmatism, had planted seeds that would take years to grow. It laid a foundation of reluctant respect between former adversaries. A decade after the war, in 1955, a rearmed West Germany was invited to join NATO. Suddenly, German officers and American officers were no longer enemies, but allies, tasked with defending Western Europe from a new threat. Many of the men who had once flown for the Luftwaffe, men who had experienced the strange mercy of an American POW camp, found themselves in advisory roles, working alongside the very people they had once fought. The bridge between sworn enemies was built, in part, by these small, shared experiences of dignity in the midst of war. Weber never rejoined the military. His war was over. But he watched these developments from a distance, understanding them in a way few others could. He finally began to write down his story, not for publication, but for himself. He needed to trace the path from the cockpit to the classroom, from a war of nations to a lesson that saved a single life. He sat at his desk for hours, the memories flowing. He wrote of the fear, the propaganda, the shock of smelling fresh bread. He wrote of the chalk dust on his fingers, and the respectful salute from an enemy colonel. "I thought captivity would strip me of honor," he wrote. "Instead, it gave me a strange duty, to teach those I once sought to kill. That duty saved me. Sometimes the enemy spares you not by lowering their weapon, but by handing you the chalk.